Welcome to the Whiskey Vault. I'm Daniel Whittington, Chancellor of Wizard Academy and Whiskey Marketing School. It's Nerd Day, children. We're talking about fermentation. So we talked about yeast, which is what creates the fermentation. Now we're going to talk about the process of the actual fermentation. Uh-oh. So, in the whiskey industry, fermentation is the process of, because there's all kinds of fermentations, but in the whiskey industry, the fermentation refers to the process of converting fermentable sugars produced from grain during mashing into ethanol and other flavor compounds. Also, carbon dioxide, heat, and congeners, right? When it gets to anaerobic respiration, which we're going to cover in just a second. We talked about mashing, where you sort of heat everything into a porridge and you convert starches to fermentable sugars, and now you've got it, but it's hot, right? So first thing you do is you cool it down, because if you dump yeast, which is a living single-cell organism, into a really hot liquid, it kills it. So first thing you do is you chill down that mash, or the wort, and somewhere between 16 and 20 Celsius, depends on your yeast, otherwise it kills it. And then you add it in a couple of ways. Some people in the craft will pitch dry yeast into it. Most often what happens is you create like a slurry, which is just like a liquid yeast mixture that's already gets the fermentation kicked off and gets yeast multiplying. And then as that starts to grow, you feed that into the line with the wort. And so as you pump your wort into your fermentation tanks, you're already adding the yeast in line with it. But there's all variations of this. Yeast now is then mixed in, right? So now you've got all the sugar grain water, and now you got yeast in there, and different strains. We talked about different flavor profiles. There are 4 phases to yeast once it reaches into this part. The first is called the lag phase, and the lag phase is when the yeast is getting acclimated to its new environment. It's not doing anything, it's just going, hey, I wonder if I like this. I don't know if I think I might like this. This is interesting. And then all of a sudden, effectively, the yeast is like, you know what? I do like this. Let's grow. and that's called the multiplication phase, where yeast starts reproducing. It starts consuming sugars and oxygen, right? It's not producing alcohol at this point. It's just consuming oxygen and sugar, and it's growing and multiplying and growing and multiplying. And then there's a stationary phase. And the stationary phase is where it runs out of oxygen. It's called the anaerobic phase. And anaerobic respiration happens, which is as soon as you deprive yeast of oxygen, but it's still got sugars, fermentable sugars to eat, it starts producing ethanol as a byproduct. And that's when you get the creation of alcohol. What's really crazy is that until the 1800s, we didn't even know that. Like, no joke. It was the 1800s that the yeast was discovered to be a single-cell organism that was controllable and you could grow it intentionally. Before that, if you read the writings, it's some version of magic to everybody. It's like, well, we know we do this, and we know we do this, and then magically we come back a couple days later and it's alcohol. A lot of wild fermentations during that time. So now it eats all of its food and it runs out of sugars. And the sugars is the gravity. So when someone called specific gravity, they're talking about how high the level of sugar is in something. And you want to get it down until there's 0 to negative sugars, which means the yeast has eaten all of its available food. That's the maximum amount of ethanol that can be produced by that. At that point, the yeast runs out of food. And this is assuming all the other ingredients of the environment are okay and it's healthy and it's not getting too hot, and they die. And that becomes the death phase of yeast. It's when yeast die, it's called autolysis. And we talked about that a little bit. In autolysis, the yeast dies and it sort of breaks apart and decomposes, and it adds itself to the mix. And that's what creates all of these fruity esters and congener flavors, right? And that's when you get flavor, not just ethanol. Very important, right? But what about the flavors? We'll talk about it in a second. First, I.W. Harper. I.W. Harper has existed since the late 1800s, launched by Isaac Wolf, I.W., right? Bernheim. It eventually got bought. I mean, it went through a whole bunch of phases. Eventually got bought by Diageo, and then Diageo basically quit releasing it in the U.S. and made it an exclusively overseas shipped product. A lot in Japan, but it was in a bunch of countries that you could get IW Harper. And it wasn't until 2010 plus, I think, when they were like, you know what, let's bring this back to the U.S. And then they brought into the U.S. their IW Harper Fancy Bottle No Age Statement one and a 15-year-old IW Harper, which we've had. This one is the Cabernet Cask Reserve. I don't know why people insist on adding words like reserve to things. They're so meaningless. It's Cabernet Sauvignon barrels from California, they say. Only the finest of California wineries. They don't name which ones. We're left to assume, I guess. Bottled at the Stitzelweller Distillery. Now, I always liked IW Harper. Each time I've tried it, I thought, yeah, that's good. Hey, I'm drinking from a Texas Whiskey Trail glass. Texas whiskey. Come and taste it. It says Kentucky bourbon. They also don't entirely disclose where it's coming from. Aged in wine barrels, Cabernet Sauvignon barrels. They also don't disclose entirely where they're coming from. Heyo, welcome to Diageo. And most large brands like that. I didn't talk about what I was smelling, but it's just classic soft bourbon, a little bit of corn sweetness, a little bit of cherry, a lot of dusty grain note, and then all of a sudden in that palate, you get sort of this like softer fruit, but it's very thin. That's the thing every time I've ever had wine cask finished, and I mean specifically not fortified wines, right? So I'm not talking about sherries or ports. I'm talking about like red wine, right? Or white wine, like just bottled, drink it by the glass, red wine. Anytime I ever have a bourbon anyway, finished in those, I always feel like it adds this fruit layer, but it's so paper thin. There's no density gets added, no richness, just a coating of sweetness gets added to things. And I'm experiencing the same thing here. The corn dust is still ramped up. It still feels like a little bit, young is the wrong word, but it's just like the grain is still very present in the nose. And then in the palate, just wine, soft, sweet. You know, I could see how someone would describe this as like luxurious or delicate or subtle, and it is. It's very soft. It drinks very soft. There's no sharp edges to it at all. It's not quite creamy, but it is gentle. And if that's what you're going for, you hit it out of the park. So well done. Okay, fermentations. Two things happen when autolysis happens and you go from creating ethanol to creating actual flavor compounds. Remember, autolysis is yeast cell dies and splits open. Congeners enter the wash at multiple points, but a lot during this time at the autolysis of yeast. Congeners are a chemical compound, parent category responsible for categories of flavors, aldehydes, esters, and so on. During fermentation, length is important. Alcohol is created roughly 48, 50 hours, give or take, because some people do temperature control and some people don't. But roughly within 48 hours, you've maxed out your ethanol creation, and everything after that is flavor creation as the yeast comes apart. And when you do that, there's yeast autolysis adds flavors, and then wild yeast, if you have open vats, and bacteria add flavors. But they can sometimes compete with the yeast and kill it off early and fight for flavor compounds. So you have to really balance those things. But they all add flavors and aromas, right? A short fermentation, 50-ish hours, it's going to create a lighter, nuttier spirit. A long fermentation, anything over 50, 55 and longer, is going to give you ever-increasing numbers of 70-hour fermentation, way more fruit, way more funk, way more bacteria. Fatty acids and esters are two of the things that created during all of this fermentation process. Fatty acids are the biochemical reaction between sugars and amino acids. It's sort of inside the yeast cells, right? And that creates aromas and contributes things like oil and mouthfeel and richness to things. Or you've got esters, which happen in the elimination process between acids and alcohols. And that's where you get, sweet fruit, pear, roses, floral, all of that stuff happens with the esters. So the longer, the more flavors, not always good, but the more flavors you get into things. And they are developed, as a matter of fact, there's been a lot of studies, and this is why people are really obsessive with their yeast programs. And so, because you find that, like, man, I'm going to argue, and I have heard this argued, and we talked about it with Dr. Don Livermore just this last week. I would argue the vast majority of flavor in whiskey, I'm even including finishing casks in this, the vast majority of flavor in whiskey is coming from flavors created by fermentation. And I'm arguing that because even in a finishing cask, most of the flavors, a lot of the flavors in wines are coming from the fermentation process, adding to the grape, right? So no matter what, you're dealing with fermentation flavors. And you can isolate them with distillation and barrel aging and things like that, but even as you barrel age and the barrel adds flavor compounds, it's still adding to what it was working with in the first place from the fermentations. So this is why distilleries are really obsessive about their yeast strains, and they're very protective of their fermentation patterns and how long. Like, oh, we always do long fermentations. We always do short. Or for this brand, we do long. For this brand, we do short. Everyone's always very protective of those because it's really that important. So remember that. There's not necessarily a right way, although most distilleries will tell you that they're doing it the right way. There's just what flavors are you trying to create. And I hope that demystifies fermentation for you just a little bit. Cheers to you, and I'm really glad you're here. My videos are too short for long fermentations. They're really too short for anything past the lag phase. But if that's okay with you, then like and subscribe.